plenary session is focusing on the research that the School of Government will be undertaking, planning, engaging with over the next few years. So it's called Governance and Policy in the Asian Century, and what we're going to do is get the Assistant Director's research and the Research Director to talk about the research strategy for the School of Government, and I'm sure they will all be picking up on various things they've heard over the last couple of days, and then it's over to you for questions and discussion to help us refine that strategy further. The session will be chaired by Maxine McHugh, who is a Vice-Chancellor's Fellow at the University of Melbourne, and Maxine, like many of the people who have chaired our sessions in the conference, is somebody who, from the get-go, has been a real supporter of the School of Government. She came and participated in our roundtable discussion in Jakarta when we had the international launch of the school, and has always been both supportive of us but keen to get involved. So it's wonderful that she has agreed to chair this session, especially as none of us really know how it's going to go. So surprises in store possibly for all of us. Maxine is Vice-Chancellor's Fellow, as I said, at the University of Melbourne, and a Distinguished Fellow of the Australia-India Institute. She also works as an advisor on education for the not-for-profit group Social Ventures Australia, and she's chair of Playgroup Australia and a member of the board of Per Capita. Her career spans both politics and journalism. At the 2007 federal election, Maxine McHugh won a spectacular victory against John Howard and wrote herself into Australian political history as only the second candidate to ever have defeated a Prime Minister in his constituency seat. For that alone, it's worth inviting her to chair the panel. But there is so much more to Maxine, and I'm delighted that she'll be chairing this session. Maxine.
Thank you very much. I hope the school doesn't pay for that partisan comment. Well, look, good afternoon, everyone. And I must say it's been a very, very enriching exercise to be here for the last 2 days. And we aim to go out on a bang. No pressure, team. But the worth and the excitement of your presentations is what stands between everyone else and their first gin and tonic later this afternoon. Look, we have 4 speakers for you this afternoon. We will lead off with Professor Jenny Lewis, who of course is the Research Director at the school, and she's Professor of Public Policy and an Australian Research Council Future Fellow and an expert in public policy and governance. Most recently, she's spent time at Roskilde University, just outside of Copenhagen, a very different educational institution from the University of Melbourne. So Jenny will lead off. Then be followed by Research Director Professor Paul Jensen. Paul is a Professor of Research at the Melbourne Institute of Applied Economic and Social Research. He will concentrate on the area of knowledge and expertise in the Asian century. And then a colleague and good friend, John Langmore, who is Assistant Director of Research. John's background covers economics, politics, time at the United Nations, and he'll address us this afternoon on the questions of security and political engagement. And then we'll be hearing from Andrew Mitchell. Andrew's expertise is in law. He's taught law in Australia, in Canada, in the United States. Had time with the law firm Allens Linklater, the global firm, and is director of the Global Economic Law Network. So 4 presentations, and then, as per usual, we'll open up to the floor. So Jenny, I'll ask you to start off, if you would.
Okay. Hopefully that's close enough that you can hear me, yes? Sounds good. Thanks very much, Maxine, and it's great to have, I guess, what I'm thinking of as our dream team here now. It's been a while to come together, but it's great to have all of our assistant directors research around our 4 major research themes for the School of Government. So I'm going to talk a little bit, just for about a minute, about our overall overarching research program, and then the 4 of us are going to spend about 10 minutes each talking about our particular theme, and we'll go from there. So the research at MSOG Agenda is really about combining excellent scholarship with a desire to really have an impact on governance and public policy making. It underpins this research, we hope, will underpin our ability really to help policymakers make sound decisions, to design and deliver effective policies and programs, and build robust institutions in Australia and the region. It's also very strongly linked, obviously, to our teaching program. Our research agenda is informed by global and regional developments, and in particular those associated with the Asian century, and hence the conference and the themes we've been discussing over the last couple of days. Within the overarching focus, we have 4 themes. The one that I'm currently leading is governance and performance, which is about designing better governing institutions and improving policy making and policy performance. Paul Jensen, who's heading up knowledge and expertise in public policy, which is specifically about using different types of evidence and new approaches and managing competing perspectives in policy making. John Langmore, who is our most recent recruit as an Assistant Director Research, is heading the security and political engagement area, which is about questions of responding to the effects of war, of natural disasters, dispossession, and improving political engagement. And Andrew Mitchell is leading up the governing markets area, which is about improving the instruments that structure relationships between governments, governing institutions, and a range of private actors. So when I describe this research program, usually the first thing that someone says, is there anything that you're not doing? It is fairly broad, but it is all focused around governance and public policy issues. The idea of the Asian century for the conference and both for our ongoing research agenda is really to focus on investigating how policy is made, managed and governed now, and the impact of country and culturally specific traditions and practices on public policy making, and how we can understand this in different contexts. So the research at MSOG, as we're calling the New School of Government, uses this idea of the Asian century as an opportunity to open up a debate about how prevailing modes of governance and public policy are being challenged as a result of changes around the globe and particularly in our region. I think a couple of other things I would say about this notion of Asia, and we have had a few interchanges, I guess, throughout the days about, what is Asia and do we need to define it? But I guess broadly the way that we see it as shaping the agenda for research at the School of Government is that it's about being future rather than backwards looking, maybe looking, to this region rather than perhaps where we've traditionally looked back to Europe and to the United States, not to say that we're ignoring them, but a bigger focus on this region, focusing on the key challenges within Asian countries and all the diversity within the Asian region that we're starting to come to grips with, and also the opportunity really to learn from policy and governance experience in the region. We've already had a couple of terrific panels where we've heard about exciting ways of facing governance and policy challenges in the region, and I think we should not be thinking that this is a sort of an outwards agenda. It's a reciprocal to and fro agenda. So that's really all I wanted to say about the overall agenda at the School of Government. You had in your research packs something that looks like this, which has a fold out. Featuring our research manager. I should just get Leanne to stand up, Leanne. Leanne McDonald is our research manager for the School of Government. A lot of you have probably met her over the last few days. And then there's some information about each of the 4 research programs. So I'm just going to say a little about governance and performance, and then I think we're going in order from left to right across the brochure. So the governance and performance theme is really about the challenges being faced in terms of legitimacy, accountability and consent at all levels, in Australia, in the region and globally. There's a series of questions about the fitness for purpose of institutions in a context of shifting power relations and the need to meet rising public expectations of what public policies and services can deliver. It's deliberately called governance, not government, even though we're the School of Government, because it's really about the act of governing. We all started using this term governance some time ago to be more dynamic and in recognition of the fact that governments do some of the governing, but governance actually is played out across a range of sectors, the private sector, the not-for-profit sector, and governments, and at multiple levels. So governing is about making policy and steering society. It's what a governing body does, how the rules are decided upon, and how they're implemented. It reflects, I think, substantial shifts in governing conditions which the world has experienced. The changing boundaries, as I've already said, between different sectors and the increasing interdependence between them. It also reflects a recognition of the complexity of many governing issues, and we've seen this come up over the last few days. Issues like climate change is an obvious one. You can't solve these kinds of things alone. And as I also said, you know, rising expectations of strong connections to citizens and communities. I've just been in a very interesting session on representation and some of the dilemmas of that facing Australia and other nations. So some people call this network governance. I'm not going to go into a lengthy discussion about whether that's the right term or not. Some people simply call it modern governance. Some people call it new governance. Some people simply say it's governance rather than government. But this is what we're about. And it's linked, obviously, to this notion that governing conditions have changed. Governments play a part in that. But what we're really doing is steering in a range of new ways that recognise that government is one actor in this space. So linked to this notion of governance, and this is the other part of this theme, is accountability and performance. Measuring performance refers to some sort of an assessment of the activities being carried out in relation to a set of responsibilities. So along with the kind of governing conditions and the fragmentation and complexity that I've described, along with that goes a series of questions about who is accountable and for what in these new governing conditions. It's become much more difficult to determine, you know, whether our governing institutions are actually fit for purpose. Are they doing what they should be doing? And who exactly should make a decision about what the assessment criteria are and who should do the measuring. So the areas of performance measurement and management have grown vastly over the last 30 years, often linked to what we call the new public management. And, you know, just the need really to demonstrate a good use of public funds. So in the theme, they're the two kind of major things, governance and performance. Our research really draws on a range of political, legal, economic frameworks to address these questions. There's a range of issues currently under investigation in the theme about the design of institutions, about improving governance and policy performance in complex policy areas, in creating better mechanisms for measuring performance, in building the innovation capacity of governments, and in challenging the performance movement. I've added that one on as a kind of a slight advertisement for a workshop that's running tomorrow on the politics and consequences of performance measurement, which I have to say is fully booked, so I'm not really sure why I'm flagging this, because if you're not signed up, you can't come. But it's going to be a great day, and it's really, you know, to focus on these kind of issues about, you know, changing accountabilities, what the politics are about who decides the measures, who wins and loses, and what the consequences are of these kinds of changing sets of conditions. So I think, how much time have I got left?
A couple of minutes.
Couple of minutes. What I'd like to finish with then is just to mention a couple of the things that we're funding under this theme. And I'm going to start with the one that's last on my list, because it's the forefront of my mind because it came up in the last session in representation, which is a grant on Indigenous nation building. I think it's hard to think of a more pressing governance issue for Australia, I would say, than to think about what does it mean to be an Indigenous person in Australia, what are the kind of citizenship issues around this, how do we kind of build theory and practice, and how do we influence the public policy discourse and governing structures around Indigenous nation building. We have a fantastic team of people. Mark McMillan, who was in the last session, has had to go from the law school, is leading this. But we have people from around the world, Stephen Cornell in Arizona, Miriam Jorgensen, also Arizona, Harvard and Washington, and just a fantastic network of people who will be working on these issues from a base of all post-colonial societies, I guess, particularly America to start with, but then building into New Zealand and Canada. So a couple of other things that we're also funding is a big project on renewing Australian federalism to tackle some of the important issues we've seen in, particularly in Australian context, and drawing on some very good and strong models of federation governance from Canada and Germany. And again, a fantastic team being led by Miranda Stewart from Law and a group of political scientists also at Melbourne, and the local Department of Premier and Cabinet is involved in that. And the final one, which is a smaller one, which is a research team looking at the policy aftermaths of financial crises and how much space there is for politics after the global financial crisis. So I'm going to leave it there. Sorry, and I should mention Andrew Walter, who's leading that, is right there in the audience.
Jenny, thank you very much indeed. And we'll hear now from Paul. Thank you, Paul Jensen.
I'm not going to be fazed by that at all, so I can start by just giving you a little bit of an introduction about who I am, the type of research I've done, and the sort of contours I'd like to see start to take shape at the Melbourne School of Government in this particular research theme, which is about knowledge and expertise in public policy. So my background, in the last 15 years, I've been working as an applied industrial economist, and I work on a range of issues from government outsourcing to agricultural trade policy, and my current area of expertise is on innovation, science and technology policy. So I've developed a deep passion for both and commitment to improving the knowledge base that we use to develop public policy in Australia and the world. And so when I was approached to come to the Melbourne School of Government and take on this role as Assistant Director, I was delighted to, because I can see a strong synergy between the work that I've been doing over the last 15 years and the sorts of opportunities that are going to emerge in the next 10 to 15 years. And so what I thought I would do is just say that, there are two observations I'd like to make up front that have got me really interested and excited about working in this particular space. The first is, and I must acknowledge Ben Jones at Northwestern University, who talks of the death of the Renaissance man. And what he means by that, he's done a series of empirical studies where he's looked at age and great invention. And so he'll do things like take the history of Nobel Prize winners across all disciplines and look at the trends that are underlying that. And he sees a couple of really important points. The first is that Nobel Prize winners are getting much older, and this is at the age when they made the discovery that won them the Nobel Prize. So that trend is very clear. And the second is that the size of the teams doing the work that lead to Nobel Prizes is increasing over time. And so it's not just that team size is increasing, it's that teams are producing higher quality research. And so he talks about this in terms of the death of the Renaissance man, saying no longer will we see the time when one person is capable of solving all of these very complex problems. And I think that's a really important point when I'm going to talk about some of the issues coming up with this particular research theme. The other idea that I think, or observation that I think is very important to the way I think about this particular research theme, is this idea that not only are we seeing some benefits to specialisation, so we've seen universities and academics become more and more and more specialised, so it's taking longer to get to the frontier, which is the fundamental reason why we're seeing the death of the Renaissance man. But universities have now recognised in the last decade that we can't stay in our silos anymore. So what's been happening as a result of this greater specialisation is that we've become less and less well equipped to deal with the really complex grand challenges that we're facing. Now, climate change is the poster child of that particular story, but of course there are many other examples that we're facing, whether it's intergenerational disadvantage or the like. And I think, you know, when you think about those two fundamental points, you can see that there's a clear wedge between the two. And what I see happening is that universities and now policymakers are starting to understand that we need to start building bridges again across these silos. And not only do we need to do that, we need to build better bridges between policy making and research. Those two communities are not talking to each other very well. And I know even in my own experience as an industrial economist, if I look at my colleagues in health economics or in education economics or in labour economics, there's much more sophisticated work that's being done in those spaces, which is trying to improve the evidence base for public policy making. And in a whole other set of areas, I see we're really lagging. And so what I'd like to try and do is to drive a new research theme at the School of Government, which will start to try and capture and improve some of those areas. I haven't quite finished. Just let me see if I can get my presentation up, and that will... Right. So, my vision then is to see to try and drive the School of Government research theme to try and help chart the way forward. And one of the key elements of that is going to be to try and embrace new tools and techniques. And so there are three key questions that I'm going to quickly pose and then talk about some of the recent developments that I think I'd like to try and embrace, or at least see scholars around the university try and embrace. So the three key questions are: what are the emerging ideas, tools and frameworks that will shape the way in which public policy is designed and implemented in the 21st century? How can evidence be best utilised in order to support the construction of better public policy and better institutions? Which I like to think of as, how do we know what works and what doesn't? And that's a really fundamental question for us to be thinking about here. So there are lots of political problems associated with trying to implement the policy, the best policy in terms of its outcomes. But even so, I think that you know, this idea that we need to have a hierarchy of evidence that's going to enable us to understand and differentiate between what works and what doesn't is a very fundamental point. And finally, how can innovation, and both methods and media, help bridge the gap between citizens and professional experts? And policymakers are included in that. So, just as my last slide, I'd like to just highlight a couple of really exciting new developments that are happening around the campus but also around the world. And the first is this emergence of big data and e-government. You know, one of the things we're seeing now is that the cost of computing power is so low compared to even 10 or 20 years ago. It gives us extraordinary power to try and glean data from existing administrative data sets. And some of the areas that that's appearing in are quite interesting. The second is that there's a greater appreciation, and I think that's even happening now within the current new federal government, an appreciation of the need for more sophisticated policy evaluation techniques so we can better answer these questions about what policies work and what ones don't. And so a couple of the examples that I wanted to mention, well, the first is we're seeing collaboration between philosophers, psychologists and economists, and this brand new area of behavioural policy making that's encapsulated by the Nudge team in the UK, who recently visited the University of Melbourne and talked to both us and the Department of Premier and Cabinet in Victoria about some of the interesting developments that we're seeing there. And that's, you know, moving us deeper into this domain of trying to unravel the complex ways in which human beings behave. And that's something that economists historically haven't been particularly good at trying to understand, and certainly by engaging and collaborating with philosophers and psychologists, we're getting much deeper insights into those particular issues. And the second is one that I'm really excited about, which is starting to crystallise around the university now, which is this emerging research program on the neuroscientific basis for antisocial behaviour. So now we've got much more sophisticated ways in which we can, relatively low-cost ways, so relative to 10 or 20 years ago, to try and observe what's going on at a very profound level within the brain and the chemical imbalances that might be happening there, and look at those through MRI scans and things like that, which are helping us understand all sorts of interesting antisocial behaviour and other social problems. So, this is an area where I think we're going to see greater influence in the future, and one in which I'd like to try and harness at the School of Government. And finally, I'd just like to mention, going back to this issue of big data, I have some colleagues in the US who have been building this wonderful new data set called the STAR Metrics Data Infrastructure, which is actually designed to help us understand the effects of government science and research funding on society. So in Australia, we've been grappling with concepts like how do we measure the impact of university research on society, and there are profound and complex measurement problems there. Don't let me diminish them in any way, shape or form. But I firmly believe that by trying to analyse these things in an empirical setting, we're going to get a much deeper understanding about the way money that flows to medical research institutes and 25 years later ends up as a vaccine that's administered in Australian and international hospitals, therefore improving health and happiness and workforce participation rates. Understanding that whole chain as it goes through that process over a 25-year period is going to give us a much better way of trying to improve society in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. And now, John, if I could call on you. Thanks for your presentation.
Thanks, Maxine. I was invited to take on this job only about 3 weeks ago, so it hasn't been a long time yet to really think about how it should be done. However, the issues of security and political engagement are ones that I've been thinking about for at least 30 years, and I'm very glad of the opportunity to work on them in a more systematic way, and I hope that's what will be the outcome of this task. It seemed to me when I was a Member of Parliament that if one was asked what is the most important thing that people in the electorates want from governments, it's to increase their security. Of course, it can be summarised in many different ways, but that, I concluded when I was a member, was the most important. And therefore, to work on that in a more systematic way is a considerable opportunity. It's obvious to all of us, I think, that we live in a time of considerable anxiety, of insecurity, and that there are many causes for those concerns. And they're surprising in a way because we also live in an extraordinarily privileged time, as other people have pointed out indirectly during this conference. Incomes are higher than they've ever been before, average incomes, and there are considerable signs of opportunity and hope in the world. I was struck at the time of the discussion about a possible US military strike on Syria, that there was a great war weariness, not only in America, but also in Australia and Europe in many areas. And that gives hope of the possibility of the effectiveness of peaceful conflict resolution. We're all aware that there's a growth in the inequality of income, which has been occurring throughout the Western world, but it's also happening to a large extent in Asia, and not least in China, of the growth of inequality. But there's growing discontent about that, and therefore there is a possibility of thinking through policies that might make some impact on that. We're all aware of the concern about climate change. That may have been declined a little in the last few years, but it's still very strong in many of us. And it's striking at the local level how much work, imaginative work, is being done about marginalisation and dispossession. I was very impressed to hear that Maxine is working with Social Ventures Australia, which is one of these innovative organisations that's working on ways of addressing marginalisation. So there are many causes of insecurity. To summarise them, They're economic, social, educational, cultural, ecological. There's also dispossession and severe inequality. Then the external factors, natural disasters, crime, violent, civil, and occasionally interstate war. And of course, there's an ongoing problem in many countries, not least in Australia, I think, about ineffective political processes and lack of effective engagement and representation. So more rigorous analysis of the causes of insecurity is required as the basis for development of policies to strengthen security. And the emphasis in the School of Government should extend beyond an analysis to study of alternative forms of innovation. In doing so, the theme must include issues of democratic legitimacy, sovereignty, rights and justice, and consideration must be given to the role and responses of both state and non-state actors, the private sector, civil society, in strengthening security and in identifying individual and collective interests and the common good. Some questions that were identified before I started, but which encapsulate some of that as examples of the issues that might be addressed are: how are risks and insecurity created and perceived by individuals, groups and governments involved in the policy process? How do these processes impact on feelings of insecurity of the person, the group and the state? What role might existing or new forms of social and political engagement at local, national and multinational levels play in enhancing security? There's so far only one project in this area which has begun, but there are a number of others that I'll quickly mention which have been suggested. The one which has started is entitled Towards a Melbourne University Intergenerational Report. It's headed by the wonderful Australian social historian, Professor Janet McCalman, and she has gathered a team of about a dozen scholars from around the university, including economists, historians, a demographer, political scientists, an educationist and an expert on sustainability. The purpose of the study is to examine the relationship between the demands for public services and constraints of fiscal policy. That many of us can see the threats to the welfare state, which, if they continued, could destroy the social contract that was established 2/3 of a century ago between citizens and the state. There are many aspects of that welfare state, and they include, of course, health services and insurance, education, handling of disability, unemployment, housing. It's struck me many times that one of the foundations of security in Australia that most people are most directly aware of is just that simple Medibank card, which gives us the right to health treatment. That inquiry is getting started and it, I think, provides the basis for the central question, which is at the heart of much political debate in Australia about the relationship of what government should be doing and the fiscal capacity to do it. A second type of issue is one about political processes. Australia's political system is characterised by a strong executive and a notably weak legislature. We rather pride ourselves on being a democracy, but in fact it can be argued that Australia is a rather autocratic political system. And it's not just the personal qualities of prime ministers that make it so, it's the nature of the way the system operates. Once governments are elected, once the Prime Minister is elected and the executive is elected or appointed, Parliament has relatively weak influence on what governments do. And it seems to me that there's a need to study that rather more closely and to look at what might be done to strengthen the democratic dimension of Australian political systems. A pretty clear example, by the way, of the autocratic nature of our system is that Parliament cannot alter by $1 the national budget. The budget is brought direct from the Budget Committee of Cabinet and Cabinet to Parliament. It's only if there's a deadlock between the Senate and the House that can be changed, and even then all it can do is knock it back and elect a new government. So you compare that with the situation in the US or in Britain, in many European countries. We have a notably weak parliament, and yet most Australians don't perceive that, and it needs to be studied more carefully, described more accurately, and ways of addressing it considered. Other aspects of political processes which have been suggested for study are the nature of political leadership. Another one is the possibility of focusing on the role of social mobilisation in shaping resource and resourcing government regimes. Another quite different project, which is already underway and which I'm working on myself, is about the nature of the Security Council, the role of the Security Council, the role of non-elected members within the Security Council. How does that contribute to peaceful conflict resolution? What is required to strengthen its capacity? Yet another proposal which has been put up for consideration by the school, an entirely different and rather fascinating area, is the idea of studying emerging military technologies as a challenge to the law of armed conflict. This study is already underway, but the school could all be drawn into it, and the study could cover cyber attacks, robotics, including drones, nanotechnology, and it would examine the legal and ethical limitations on their use. So there's already a range of possibilities underway or under consideration. I hope that this meeting and many others will generate more ideas about policy, about projects that the school might take on in this area. Thanks.
John, thank you very much.
Well, thanks very much. Well, as Maxime mentioned, my background is in international law with a focus on international trade and investment law. And obviously this is an area that's quite closely interrelated with economics and also with politics. And so I was really delighted to accept the offer to take up the position of Associate Director of Research on the governing markets theme. Now, like Paul mentioned, interdisciplinary approaches are necessary to address many of today's complex problems. Something that I most recently appreciated working as a member of the government's expert advisory panel on plain packaging of tobacco products, which was a group made up of health experts, economists, lawyers, amongst others. But what's the theme concerned with? This is telling us we're running a pirated version of Microsoft Office.
Oh, no trouble.
So these are really the three key questions that my research theme's concerned with. The first is, how do governments, governing institutions and private actors relate to one another? And what can and should be the roles of these actors in the governance of different markets? Also, what different policy instruments are available to govern the different sites and spaces of market activity, from global to local, also formal to informal? And finally, what is the efficacy and the impact of these policy instruments, and how can they be measured and compared? Now, the theme includes an analysis of domestic, international and multilateral governance of markets, as well as also a comparative analysis of different institutions. So for example, a cluster grant that I'll talk about in a little bit more detail later on considers the lessons that countries in the Asian region can learn from recent developments in financial regulation in the EU and in the United States. The interaction between these different levels of governance is particularly important in the Asian region, where there's an increasingly complex regime of international agreements, institutions, and so, for example, in the area of international trade and investment, there are numerous bilateral agreements between states that already exist, established regional organisations such as ASEAN, and new international and regional agreements that are under negotiation, such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. These different bilateral and regional agreements influence domestic policy and also interact with multilateral regimes, obviously, such as the WTO. The theme will also examine how non-state actors are playing a very significant role in the governance of natural resource-based industries in the Asian region, either in the absence or in cooperation with governments. So, for example, the Worldwide Fund for Nature, Arhaus United UK, Migros, the Malaysian Palm Oil Association and Unilever established the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, which is an organisation that attempts to promote sustainability in the palm oil industry by involving both NGOs, growers, manufacturers, retailers, as well as banks and investors. Similarly, as one of the incubator grants for this theme will examine voluntary corporate social responsibility, or CSR programs implemented by transnational firms that obviously play a very important role in the governance of mining activities in developing countries. And finally, this theme will consider the impact of creating, intervening and managing markets in relation to a range of different policy goals, such as enhancing competition, increasing accessibility, reducing environmental externalities, or modifying and reinforcing different cultural norms. Now, research on the governing markets theme is still at a fairly early stage, but I believe that it shows great promise. And I think that's best illustrated by discussing some of the projects that have already received funding and what the scope of those projects are. So 2 of the 3 projects that have been funded to date have a focus on the Asian region, including the Incubator Grant on Corporate Social Responsibility, which has a case study on Central Asia, and the Cluster Grant that I'll talk about has a very clear focus on the Asian region. 2 of the projects include international academics in the research team, while all of the projects that are being funded have some aspect of international cooperation. Now, each project also has very clear relevance to non-academic audience as well, such as government agencies, but also corporations and regional bodies. And specifically 3 projects have been funded to date. 2 of those are what's described as incubator grants. The first is price transparency in Australian petrol markets. The second is titled The Power of the Good Corporation. And the cluster grant is on financial regulation in Asia. And I'm just going to spend a little bit of time now discussing those 3 projects in turn. So first, talking about the incubator grants. So the first incubator grant under the governing markets theme investigates how information technology can be used to enhance the information that's available to consumers to increase the competitiveness of retail markets. And so this project uses Australian and North American experience of public price monitoring websites as a case study to analyse the potential of information technology to deliver increased competitiveness. It's applying quite an innovative empirical approach to this analysis. So the project's aims are to assist regulators by promoting retail competition and enhancing consumer welfare, and also to examine the extent to which findings from the petrol market case study can inform competition authorities using price transparency schemes as a tool for promoting competition and efficiency in other retail markets. So potentially it has enormous application even beyond petrol markets. And this type of research is directly relevant to competition authorities, obviously in Australia, such as the ACCC, that administer competition and consumer law, but also economic policy makers. In Australia, we're talking about Treasury, obviously, and markets groups that are really concerned with trying to develop policies promoting well-functioning and very efficient markets. And finally, the findings of this research will be relevant to consumer groups, associations and petrol companies. And there are 4 members of this team working on the project. So we have Professor Karen Beaton-Wells from the Law School, Dr. David Byrne from Economics, Business and Economics, and then we have 2 members of the team from outside the university, one from Sydney and one from Queen's. The second incubator grant is titled The Power of the Good Corporation. And obviously understanding how corporate social responsibility varies across the world has really tended to frame firms as being quite passive in the context of external and contextual pressures. But it seems that firms do retain quite considerable agency in the form and extent of corporate social responsibility that they practice. And this research suggests that firm agency will be particularly prevalent in environments with relatively weaker institutions and where firms are relatively more powerful. And so this project's going to set the foundations for an extensive exploration of the role and the power of comparative corporate social responsibility through a focus on the mining industry in developing countries, where they expect power in the power of corporate social responsibility really to be exemplified. And so this project is going to involve interviews in a developing country with early plans for interviews to be carried out in Kyrgyzstan, I believe. The intended audience will have relevance to mining companies, mining industry groups such as the International Council for Mining and Metals, the Minerals Council of Australia, and related organisations such as mining contractors and suppliers. And also this research is very important and relevant to non-profit organisations and government agencies that deal with the impacts of mining. So here we're talking about Oxfam, World Vision, CSIRO and DFAT. And there are 2 members of this team. So we have Dr. Ben Neville from Business and Economics, and we have Dr. Sarah Bryce from Arts, who's in the audience here, if you want to give a quick wave. Now, the final aspect is the cluster grants. And the themes-funded cluster grant is titled Financial Regulation in Asia. And by way of overview here, the increasing sophistication of Asian financial markets has the potential to create many of the problems that we've seen quite dramatically, that have been experienced quite dramatically by the West in the Asian region. In recent years, we've seen quite a rapid and sweeping reforms to financial regulation in Europe and in the United States. Now, these developments mean that there now is an opportunity to proactively identify the lessons learnt from the West's development and their regulatory integration experience, as well as considering what are the unique circumstances and risks that are present in the Asian context, to try to evaluate the suitability of global regulatory frameworks in Asia and the value that regional cooperation could play in the development of Asian financial regulations. Now, this research project is going to explore whether greater regional cooperation and financial regulation and integration is needed in Asia in light of what to date has been quite a US and EU centric development of international regulatory standards and rules. And also to consider what is the appropriateness of possible forms of regional architectures to achieve greater regional cooperation. Now, this project is quite novel due to its interdisciplinary approach and its examination of the relevant issues from a variety of different perspectives, such as finance, law, politics, and international relations. And obviously, again, this is a project that has relevance to a wide, really beyond policy-making bodies involved in financial regulation in Australia and beyond, including the Australian Prudential Regulatory Authority, the Reserve Bank, and other departments such as Treasury, DFAT, PMC, and the equivalent national policy-making institutions in other countries in Asia. It's also going to be a project that's very relevant to regional and multilateral bodies such as the Asian Development Bank, the Bank for International Settlements, the International Monetary Fund, and ASEAN. And then finally, the project's relevant to private sector, industry organisations and firms in banking, law and consulting. And we have quite a large team working on this particular project. We have Professor Andrew Walter in the audience, as well as Dr. Jikun Lee from Arts. It's a great team. Our main problem with the team is that we have too many people called Andrew in the team, but we're working on dealing that. We're in fact just renaming everyone else in the team Andrew as well. So I think you'll agree that although it's a fairly early stage, we have quite an exciting research agenda evolving in the governing markets theme, and it's one that I'm looking forward to working on in the next few years. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Well, four very compelling presentations there that raise a lot of questions. So we've got about 30 minutes for questions. I suppose, can I just kick off by saying that, or remarking really, that you've all talked really around this whole business of the interdisciplinary approach, of course, which is exactly what the school is bringing together. And Paul, I was taken by your statement there, the death of Renaissance Man, but of course what you're pointing to is the creation of the Renaissance team, and bringing all of those disciplines together. I'm just wondering, have you got some good examples of where whether it came from the presentations from the Nudge Group, where the pulling together of the economists, the philosophers, the psychologists and others is actually aiding both the design and implementation of good public policy?
The implementation is still very difficult. So areas where I think that they're having most success at the moment would be with regard to design. Now, in terms of giving you concrete examples, I'm not sure that I can think of any off the top of my head. But let me talk a little bit more about the ideas anyway. So, in principle, what we're trying to do is unravel the mystery of Homo economicus, the idea that people behave in rational ways and only behave in rational ways. And so the idea here is that we can perhaps find out a little bit more about ways in which they seem to behave in ways that you would call irrational. And there are lots of interesting areas where that occurs. And so what this nudge policy-making group in the UK is trying to do, and I know that there are some, not just visitations to Melbourne, but there are currently people working in New South Wales government who are actually looking at trying to implement some of these tools and techniques in Australia more broadly. And I think they really will be an exciting avenue for future public policy development. But perhaps I'll leave it open to others to comment or raise issues of examples, specific examples that they know of in ways that are helping shape design public policy.
Jenny, do you want to add to that?
It's only a matter of time before we knock that jug of water over and splash the front row. Yeah, I wanted to say a couple of things about that. I think one was the obvious commercial that in relation to collaborative teams, there's a number of ways in which you can think about this, but I think an opportunity for the School of Government is to be very creative about this. And we've just, amongst your conference material, we've included our first issues paper, which is actually co-written by Paul and myself. And what it does, instead of trying to actually get us to agree, he presents the economist's perspective on the topic of evidence-based policy, and I present the political science perspective. And then at the end, there's an attempt to kind of bring these two things together. I mean, I think that last Friday I was actually giving a talk on the perils of collaboration. So now I'm here saying interdisciplinary work's wonderful, but I think that, there are a number of ways in which the School of Government can do this kind of work through the kind of teams that we're funding to do research projects. But there's some obvious things where we can just do sort of countervailing perspectives from different discipline backgrounds on topical things like evidence-based policy. So I just wanted to mention that.
Okay. Yes, question. Who would like to? Yes.
Andrew Walter, School of Government. I had a question about, I'm all in favour of breaking down the disciplinary boundaries in the way that you're talking about. There's always a danger, of course, of creating new boundaries with the three major themes. Because some really crucial issues, I think, clearly do cut across the themes. And perhaps this is mainly a question for Paul, but also for Andrew. There's not a linear relationship between evidence and knowledge on the one hand and good policy outcomes on the other. And Ross Garnaut was talking just yesterday about policy capture and the importance of vested interests and lobby groups. And there is some, as you'll know, Paul, some evidence suggesting that more knowledge than evidence only confirms pre-existing ideological biases and provides evidence to vested interests that they use as ammunition to support their case. And so, I'm wondering how we might explore these kinds of problems in really important policy areas that face not only Australia but other countries.
Right. Well, we've started out with the two tough questions. That's great. Both been directed at me. Thank you, Andrew. Yes. So you're right in the sense that there is no linear relationship between these things. And I grossly simplified the story by saying, it is easy to figure out what works and what doesn't. And of course, it isn't. And even when you move away from environments where you have vested interests that are producing research or funding research to suit their own needs, you can imagine a world in which you do have this very difficult process of taking, even if you can figure out what works, implementing it. And that is, in fact, the major thrust of the first policy brief that Jenny was referring to that we co-wrote, where we looked at some of those complexities. And so I think Jenny liked to characterise that as the technocrat versus the pragmatist. I'm talking about the techniques and tools that can be used to try and improve public policy, and Jenny's saying, well, hang on a minute, even if you can do that, implementing these things is going to be very difficult. So it certainly is a challenge for us, and I don't want to diminish how difficult that challenge is going to be, but I certainly believe that there are ways in which we can push things forward in terms of a deeper understanding of both design and implementation issues.
Could I just mention there actually a public policy conundrum in the education area at the moment where I'm doing a lot of work. Quite a lot of people have had a national heart attack over the latest PISA results, which show a decline not just among our low SES students but among our brighter students, and that has been a trend since 2000. This is happening at a time when we've never known more about what it is that works, about the precise teaching practice that is very effective. and that we do see it in some schools and in some of our poorer schools where we see a significant turnaround. What that is not delivering us, though, is any lift across the system. And that comes back to your point about implementation. We know a lot, we know a hell of a lot about what works, but it's the question of implementing it across the board and across sectors to get that overall lift in national performance. There are many the answers that are being, coming to the fore. One of them comes around the capacity of schools, and particularly the capacity of individual leaders in schools to actually implement, as I say, a precise pedagogy and to put learning at the very centre of their institutions. And it's a live question in education circles. So, anyone else want to comment on that point? Okay. Yes.
Hi, my name is Angela Merriam. I have a question probably for all the panelists. I just wanted to see if anyone would like to elaborate in more depth or broaden the sort of scope of discussion from the projects that are happening right now to maybe future areas of research in terms of what Australia or perhaps other OECD countries may learn from the Asian experience. The obvious examples to me are innovation policy, science, technology, financial regulation, this kind of thing. But I think there are numerous examples of sort of avenues of research, and I'm curious to see what you as experts in this field think may be useful for Australia.
Who'd like to take that one?
Okay. Yeah, another easy one. I think the themes that we've come up with, we hope are broad enough to kind of capture the major thrusts into the future without really prescribing in advance too strongly what sorts of things people will be interested in doing. We're academics. The way that we're trying to engage people is to make it a bottom-up process. So in a sense, it's what are the best academic minds in the fields coming up with as the projects that we should be looking at into the future. And so the grants we've been talking about have only just been awarded in the last few months. And we will be having another round early in the new year and another round towards the middle of next year. But I think, there will be some sort of strategic direction into the future, and I'm sure that all of us on this panel have our own pet topics that we would like to see. But I think, from the School of Government's perspective and the research strategy, we want the best people to be coming to us with their best ideas that are aligned with these four main themes. And then, and putting together a team and tackling some of these problems.
The only thing I'd add to that is that I don't know what the answer is, really, but I think that a number of the issues that we should be dealing with are also ones which many Asian countries need to deal with as well, and there may well be value in doing so together. I think that some of the central questions that I mentioned are not ones that Asian countries any more than Australia have really found the answers to, and I think we need to be in dialogue about the process of analysis and learning.
I'm happy to talk about one of my little pet projects that I'd like to see happen, because I think it does have some relevance to the sorts of issues you were talking about, specifically innovation, science and technology policy. And, one of the big debates in economics has been, at what point in your economic development pathway do you need patents and trademarks and other types of intellectual property rights? And so the general consensus would be that as an immature developing nation, don't have them at all. and you're better off effectively free riding off the R&D investments that everyone else around the world makes and using them and just capturing the knowledge diffusion by imitation and copying and things like that, which has its dark side when people call it piracy, but in fact it's exactly the same thing as imitation. And as you move along that spectrum and become more developed, you're much more interested in trying to protect your own intellectual property rights via various means like patents. So, you know, when we're thinking about many of our Asian neighbours, we should be looking at ways in which we can try and help them understand in a much deeper way about how to move from developing to developed nations and how intellectual property rights may or may not play a role in doing that. And that's certainly something I'm actively interested in looking at the moment. And for those who were in the presentation that I gave earlier this morning, I talked a little bit about this Asia Pacific Innovation Network that I'm on the board of directors of. And we are looking at ways in which we can start to stimulate a deeper understanding and a community of scholarship and engagement around those particular issues.
Well, I certainly think that's a very interesting issue that Paul's examining, and certainly intellectual property is one of the most controversial aspects of the Trans-Pacific Partnership that's currently under negotiation. I don't really know what issues will be explored in the future to do with my theme, but one of the, and Andrew Walter mentioned the issue of overlap, and one very important issue I think that probably should be addressed is this issue of income inequality, which was also mentioned in the security theme, which is also obviously relevant to the governing markets theme, and the question of the role of markets in exacerbating the problem of income inequality.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Sarah Weiss from the School of Government. So I'm sorry the School of Government is kind of talking to one another, but I actually want to open this up to the room, because we all have spent 2 days and devoted our time and energy, because whether or not we agree or disagree about the issues or how you define Asia or whether or not it's the Asian century, we're interested in the general topic and we're here. And one of the things that's come up throughout multiple sessions across the conference has been collaboration. What is collaboration? How do we collaborate? And if we're going to talk as a school strategically about what we're going to do next and how to move into the Asian century, I think it's worthwhile asking both our research directors, but also those of you who are here, how do we collaborate effectively? What is it that you need from the school? What can the school do for you? And how do we all work together? Because it's a lot easier to decide it when we're in the room than once we've gone off. Except, I mean, obviously we can talk on Twitter. So.
Well, there you are. A very precise challenge. How do we work together? So do you want to, who's going to respond directly to that? Yes? Or did you have another topic? No. Okay. Well, I tell you, can I just hold there? Could we just? That's a worthwhile question. Who'd like to bounce off that? Anyone on the panel or in the audience?
Yeah, I'm happy to have a first go at it. I mean, you know, I always tend to think, and people have been talking about, you know, where is the market failure here? There's two people who want to collaborate, and where are the barriers that are actually stopping them? And I think, you know, there is a sense in which you can think about a market failure or a coordination failure at the very least, in terms of finding other people who are interested in working on the same project as you and jointly developing them. So, you know, one of the key roles that I see I play in the School of Government is acting as a broker. And, you know, acting as an agent for change, so you can catalyse activity by introducing people that you think might be able to go off and explore interesting ideas together. And they don't always work, but I think it's important to bear in mind that, you know, collaboration is costly. It's not easy to go out and search for someone to go and work with. That activity is costly, and so there better be some expectation of higher rewards than just sitting in your office on your own and doing it. And so, you know, I think that, you know, one of the key roles that I can play as an agent of change is to try and be a broking agent.
Is there a common language, by the way?
No.
You know, wait, is that one of the problems?
Oh, it's a huge problem. Absolutely.
So give me an idea. What are the barriers?
Oh, so I'll give you a classic one. So I have worked as part of the Intellectual Property Research Institute of Australia for the last 10 years. I'm a fellow there, and it's a joint virtual institute at the University of Melbourne between the law school, the business school and the economists. And I learnt very quickly, just how difficult and challenging that environment was. And part of the problem was, and this is a simple description of the differences between the way we think, but the lawyers very much think of a world in a descriptive or a positive sense. This is the way the law is. We can disagree or have disagreements about how we interpret the law, but it very much says that's the way the world is. And the whole nature of the economic discipline is a normative one. This is the way the world should be. And until you reconcile those two differences, the positive and the normative, you're talking at cross purposes all the time. Now, that's not to say there are lots of people who have got both economics and law degrees, Andrew being one of them, and have a deeper understanding of how you can bridge those gaps. But for those that don't, you really are talking at cross purposes. And so it's not just there's language barriers, there's whole conceptual, metaphysical differences in the way we think about the discipline and the challenge.
And Jenny, sorry, John, you want to comment?
Yeah, I worked at the UN, United Nations, for 5 years, and of course we had to do this all the time, and I continue to do it. I'm part of various networks, and of course the communications are so fantastic now that one's part of networks of large numbers of people and get instantaneous exchange. At the UN, we used to have meetings of experts. Now, of course, the difficulty is to identify, which is what you're saying, but part of what you're saying anyway, the difficulty of finding the appropriate experts, and then the difficulty of paying for them to get together. And there's no alternative at some points in these processes to get together. You can, but once you've met, then you can go on communicating instantaneously. So those are parts of the answers.
Right. Jenny, did you want to add to that?
I'll just say something a little more about, well, I guess two things. The first is about interdisciplinary collaboration, and it brings to mind a project that, I spent I don't know how many hours on working with engineers, information systems people, behavioural scientists, sociologists, and myself. And it took us about a month until we'd worked out what each other's assumptions actually were before we could have a conversation. And that's even before you reach outside the academy. So I think, Paul said this beautifully. There are a lot of costs to collaboration. I think, all of us sitting on this panel believe it's worth doing, but we shouldn't forget that there is actually a lot of transaction costs and a lot of groundwork that needs to be done to do this well. And I hope that, I keep coming back to, sorry, I'm here with my research director hat on rather than my governance and performance theme hat on, is that, what the School of Government, I hope, will do is support people in learning how to do collaboration. Humanities and social science people, particularly humanities people, have had much less experience in this. And we're trying to work across so many boundaries and with people outside the academy. I think we really need some good sessions on tools. How do we work together? How do we get, over some of those fundamental problems to make productive collaborations, not collaborations that end in, oh my God, I'm never doing that again.
I'll put in an ad here and a plug for Professor Patrick Griffin in conjunction with Dr. Esther Kerr. They're putting together a MOOC which will be available, I think, April next year and be on Coursera, and it's in developing and assessing for 21st century skills. And of course, one of those key skills is working in teams. So it may be very helpful. Now there's a lady over here for a question.
Hi, I'm working in Victorian government. I raised my hand when I did because I empathise with that question, not necessarily that I had a response for it, but I've been sitting here listening to the projects and the different research themes, trying to understand the projects and the approach that you're taking, while trying to also process a lot of the discussions that's been happening in the last 2 days, and in a sense trying to seek a bit of a meta-narrative of our discussions to place the projects within. And it seems the meta-narrative is still quite, it's anything but lucid and articulate. We're still grappling with, is it about us and them, or us becoming a different kind of us in this Asian century, and the nuanced ideas and understanding we're supposed to sort of seek as we try to develop these capacities. And I do recognize the challenge in keeping the broad picture in mind when you're trying to focus on a specific project. But as you go on as a School of Government, is there room for that kind of more meta-narrative about what does it mean for Australia to be in Asian century, and you know, all those kind of questions that are still lingering? Where is that going to go in your future work?
Just before we get any responses from the panel, do you have in your own mind actually a tight definition? Help us out here.
Well, I kept hearing the developing and the developed, and there's something a little bit unsettling about, and of course that's a distinction of framework that needs to exist because it's reality. But in my own experience of kind of interacting with women's human rights NGOs in Australia and South Korea, this kind of quote-unquote third world women title didn't fit the South Korean NGO scene, especially dealing with women's rights, because they're so much more vibrant and stronger than Australian current, you know, scene of grassroots and civil society and women's rights. So, you know, there's just kind of an unsettling discomfort in applying some of those dualistic frameworks like developed and developing. And although there is a necessity to it, I just have the desire for that to be developed and recognized as we move on to other more thematic and project-based kind of discussions.
Good point. I'd like to take John.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. But of course, a lot of the problems that we've been talking about have to be addressed in a global way. If we're talking about inequality, for example, then that requires not only national responses but also some global ones. And if you are dealing with employment or climate change or human rights or 100 other issues, they have to be addressed globally because they can't be addressed nationally adequately, effectively. So I think the shorthands of development and developed and developing are out of date and need to be put aside, and we need to talk in holistic global terms, have a language like that, but also a conceptualization of the problems and their solutions that's like that.
Yes.
Thank you, all of you, for your comments and your explanations and for telling us about these exciting research agendas. One of the things that has struck me during these 2 days, which have been so productive and so fruitful, but also to a certain extent frustrating, because we still haven't talked about what we mean by the Asian century and where Australia fits in it, and that's what we're trying to problematise. I've been working on a project with a number of other people on Australia as an awkward partner in its region and comparing it with the UK and Sweden in the European Union, and with Japan also in the Asia-Pacific region. And I'm also working on another project called Drivers of Regionalism in Europe and Asia, which has 30 participants from a number of continents. And on the one hand, what it is that drives and inhibits regional governance and regional belonging is part of the latter, but it's also part of the former. Why is Australia not mentioned in many debates about Asian regionalism and Asian regional governance in Asia or in Europe? Why is it that Europe is rarely mentioned in the context of comparative regional governance here in Australia, for instance? So I think there are some synergies there and quite a lot of nexus, both research policy nexus, but also comparative elements, which I think are as important as the interdisciplinary ones, and I favour both. And I just thought I'd raise that because Australia's sense of belonging is something that's been an undercurrent of today and yesterday, and it is regarded as an awkward partner. I mean, it's a term of actually the UK, in many ways. And I just thought I'd raise those two projects that I'm involved in, just really to sort of talk about this sense of belonging in particular, which in a sense is part of how we're talking about how public policy and policy makers, among others, can grapple with Australia's belonging in the region and indeed what comparative regionalism is about. Thank you.
Can I just comment that, of course, Australia is insignificant to most of the rest of the world, and we have to be realistic about that, but that's something we've got to promote Australia about. But it also does give us more freedom because the rest of the world doesn't constrain us in the way that many other countries are constrained. We're not locked into a European Union. We're not locked into some other kind of regional organisation. We have a remarkable degree of international political freedom, which we need to learn to use.
And I'll come over here for the our last question.
It's not so much a question really as a response to what Sarah said, looking out to the audience. And what I want to say is my name's Nick Bastow. I'm from the Institute for Public Administration Australia, so a professional association for people who work in the public service. And I think that one of the things that we've noticed at IPA with the new School of Government has been this sense of reaching out to public administrators. There are about 250,000 of them in Australia at state and federal levels. They're intimately involved in the sort of the work that government itself does. And one of the exciting things I think has been to see some of the research ideas and at the school, but not only the research ideas, that sort of commitment to linking them to the 250,000 people whose work fundamentally helps deliver what government does in Australia. And so I just wanted to say that I think it's been very exciting listening to the research agenda going forward and the commitment that you've seen to sort of getting that research, linking practitioners up with academic researchers. It's really, really exciting.
Good. Well, look, thank you for that. We're close to time, and I'm going to ask Helen to come up here to do the formal close. But just before that, could you please thank our panel for us?